Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and this is the M10 Wolverine tank destroyer that I built up last week. Someone remind me to put a link in the video description for that. Today's video will see me paint it, and as I've painted a few American vehicles in nearly exactly the same way, I wanted to try something different. I usually start by painting it all green, and then put the weathering on top. This time I'll do it the other way around by putting the weathering underneath by airbrushing some dark brown and black over the whole vehicle. Then, in a step that seems very strange but is actually a fairly common technique in the model painting world, I will douse the entire thing with hairspray. What hairspray does is sort of the opposite of a primer, in that it makes a layer that paint will stick to, but by picking at it or scraping at it, you can create literal paint chips rather than simulated ones. With no idea how long it takes to dry, I forgot about it for several days and eventually got back to painting the green over the top. I've been painting the modulation style on just about every vehicle I've done in recent months, so I'm sure you're bored with the details of that. But in short, I put a light green in the middle of each armor panel to frame them visually. Thankfully that's all I have to do with the airbrush, and we can get on to do some real brush work. And that includes brushing on some allied stars, a nice big one on the front and a smaller one on the turret. Given the sheer quantity of nubs and bolts and other protrusions on the M10, there's just about nowhere flat enough to put a decal easily, and so I placed them as best I could and cut out the transfer around the details that I couldn't avoid. I wasn't sure if I wanted to paint these over in white or to leave them green poking through the decal and just clean up the edges, but this one on the front looks like a smiley face, so I had to keep that. Moving around the vehicle, I found all the little details that I could paint up in interesting colours. The ready ammunition obviously got some brass paint, and all the boxes in the turret got brown. I assume they are wood. Whilst I had the brown and brass on the wet palette, I mixed them for the racks on the side of the hull, and I got some silver as well for the engine vents and the tracks. And whilst a lot of these details are a little boring to just pick out Y detail with X paint, the spade is the most important one, naturally. All of my American models so far have a spade. If you remember from the build video, there is this little plate in the middle of the hull because the open turret means you can see all the way through it. And I did paint this with all the greens, and I'll get the black wash on here so that I can glue down the upper hull. And for that I just scraped the edges of plastic to make sure that there were good adhesion surfaces, as polystyrene cement tends to stick polystyrene better than it does paint. I can also fit the turret pieces together in the same way, ensuring that the gun is in place and the halves of the turret go together in the way that I showed in the build video. But before I get the black wash onto the rest of the model, I needed to clean up the star just with a little bit of white paint around the applique armor bolts. I also wasn't sure if I'd painted the decals with matte varnish, and so I did that again. The matte varnish usually takes down the shine of the transfers and help hide the plasticky edge, but in this case the transfers are quite noticeably transfers. And now the black wash that I always use over the whole vehicle, darkening it and giving a subtle panel line effect for some of the innermost edges. At this point it really is just for consistency's sake, but I do like the way that model tanks look with a dark wash on them. I was slightly worried that the wash would activate the hairspray layer, as water is often the way that that's done, but this went on with just few enough brush strokes that it wasn't physically agitating it enough to remove any of the green paint just yet. There is one quick step I want to do just before I start stabbing at the hairspray, and that is a little edge highlight just to emphasize the silhouette of the tank. And as I've mentioned, I'm doing the same techniques that I often do, and I remembered that I'm supposed to be experimenting with the hairspray technique rather than just painting it exactly the same way as every other Yankee tank I've done. So, the paint chipping then. I have seen a few videos on the subject, but as is usual for me, I abjectly refuse to follow the instructions. So I went around a few different ways of removing the upper layers of paint to see how the process behaved, to see what works, and to see if I could have some different visual effects by removing the paint in different ways. My first few corners were simply to put some water on a panel with a soft brush and slowly agitate it, and this really did not get any effect at all. I was being so gentle that the green paint wasn't really being damaged in the slightest. For a lot of the model I moved over to a harsher brush, and this is my very favourite brush of all time, and I lament for it is not long for this world. With this brush I stabbed and scraped much more harshly, and at points I was even scratching the model with the ferrule through the brushes. I'm sure that scraping it with the ferrule directly would just scrape all the way down to the plastic. And whilst I don't have good footage of some of my other experiments, I also scratched it with my fingernails. The amount of force I think I would require to remove the green would probably also dig all the way through to the plastic below. One other thing I tried that I think was rather successful was to use a piece of wet kitchen roll, which is something that I'd like to try again on a future vehicle, because I think this has the right balance of agitation to remove the upper layers of paint but leaving the brown underneath. Well, here we go, the M10 Wolverine tank destroyer. Between the hairspray chipping, the wash, modulation, the surface of the vehicle has so much character. And this is something I've always tried to achieve when painting vehicles, as this is how real tanks look, rather than the more artistic fades of colour, which is also cool, and I have some of that style of painting coming up on the channel soon as well. This video wasn't necessarily as long as some of my others, partially as I'm sort of rehashing a lot of my previous videos in terms of how I paint American vehicles, and only really the hairspray chipping is new, which is certainly something I want to come back to and experiment with more. Hopefully you still found it interesting to watch, but for now, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.